In 2012, a team of forensic scientists and Egyptologists, led by the renowned Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, placed the mummy of a pharaoh who had died more than 3,100 years earlier into a modern computed tomography scanner in a hospital in Cairo. The mummy had been examined before, unwrapped by 19th century researchers, studied by 20th century archaeologists, photographed and catalogued, and placed in a museum case where tourists could file past and stare at the preserved face of a man who had once ruled the most powerful, the most economically productive, the most institutionally sophisticated, the most administratively advanced, and the most culturally creative state in the ancient world. The last surviving great power of the Bronze Age world, the oldest and most culturally productive civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, the civilization that had built the pyramids and the temples and the tombs, and the magnificent artistic traditions that tourists and scholars from around the world study and visit and marvel at today. But no one had ever looked beneath the heavy linen bandages that covered the pharaoh's neck. No one had ever seen what the ancient embalmers had so carefully and so deliberately hidden. The CT scanner, product of a medical technology that the pharaoh's civilization could not have imagined, a machine that uses X-rays and computer algorithms to construct three-dimensional images of the interior of the human body, saw what no human eye had seen in more than 3,000 years. The scanner penetrated the linen wrappings, the resin coatings, the embalming materials, and the thick collar of bandages that the ancient mortuary priests had so carefully wrapped around the pharaoh's neck. And what it revealed changed everything that scholars had believed about the death of one of the most important rulers in the history of the ancient world. The CT scanner saw it. Beneath the thick collar of linen that the embalmers had wrapped around the pharaoh's throat was a wound, a deep, savage cut, 70 millimeters wide, that had sliced through the trachea, the esophagus, and the major blood vessels of the neck, penetrating all the way to the 5th through 7th cervical vertebrae. The wound would have caused immediate death. The embalmers had inserted a Horus Eye amulet, a symbol of healing and protection, into the wound before wrapping it, as though the ancient ritual could repair what the assassin's blade had destroyed. They had covered the wound with layer after layer of linen, concealing the evidence of the murder beneath the sacred wrappings, hiding the terrible and shocking truth about the pharaoh's death for more than 31 centuries. Further scans revealed more. The pharaoh's left big toe had been hacked off, cleanly, violently, with an axe or a sword, by a different weapon than the blade that had cut his throat. The toe wound had never healed, meaning it had been inflicted at the same moment as the throat wound, or very shortly before. The embalmers who prepared the pharaoh's body for the afterlife had done their best to conceal the evidence of the murder. They had covered the throat wound with thick layers of linen, wrapping the neck in a heavy collar of bandages that hid the gash from view. They had inserted a Horus Eye amulet, a sacred symbol of healing, protection, and restoration, into the wound itself, pressing the small faience object into the severed tissues, as though the magical power of the amulet could repair what the blade had destroyed. They had fashioned a prosthetic toe from linen and resin to replace the one that the axe had severed, covering the false digit with additional layers of wrapping, so that the pharaoh's body would appear complete and uninjured to the gods who would judge him in the afterlife. The extraordinary care, the technical skill, and the devotion of the embalmer's work, the meticulous concealment, the ritual insertion of the healing amulet, the fabrication of the prosthetic toe, speaks to a deep devotion to the pharaoh and to the religious obligations that the embalmers took with the utmost seriousness and devotion, even in the aftermath of an assassination that must have sent shockwaves through the entire Egyptian court. The forensic conclusion drawn from the CT scans and from subsequent analysis was stark and chilling. The pharaoh had been attacked by at least 2 assailants simultaneously, one from behind with a knife or a dagger, one from the front with an axe or a sword. The attack had been coordinated, planned, and executed with the precision of a military operation. The pharaoh had been assassinated. The ancient court documents, the judicial papyrus of Turin, a series of legal texts that record the trial of the conspirators, who organized the assassination, had been known to scholars for more than a century. The documents describe the conspiracy in detail: the plotters, the motives, the methods, the trial, and the punishments. But the documents had never clearly stated whether the assassination attempt had succeeded or failed. They described the conspiracy and the trial of the conspirators, but they did not explicitly record the pharaoh's death. For more than a century, scholars debated whether Ramesses III had been killed by the conspirators, or whether he had survived the attack and died of other causes. The 2012 CT scans settled the debate with the finality of a forensic autopsy conducted 3,100 years after the murder. The pharaoh was Ramesses III, the second ruler of the 20th dynasty of ancient Egypt, the man who has been called the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, the warrior king who defeated the Sea Peoples and saved Egypt from the civilizational catastrophe that was destroying, one by one, every other great power in the eastern Mediterranean. He had reigned for approximately 31 years, from roughly 1186 to 1155 BC, a reign that spanned one of the most turbulent, most dangerous, and most historically consequential periods in the entire 3,000-year recorded history of the Egyptian pharaonic state. His reign coincided precisely and catastrophically with the Bronze Age collapse, the devastating, comprehensive, and historically unprecedented disintegration of the interconnected civilization that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, and his military victories over the Sea Peoples and the Libyans were the only successful and decisive defences mounted by any major power against the forces of migration and destruction that were sweeping across the ancient world. He had fought and won some of the most important battles in the history of the ancient world. He had built one of the largest and best-preserved temples in all of Egypt. He had held together a kingdom that was being battered by invasion from without, by the Sea Peoples, by the Libyans, by the forces of migration and displacement that were devastating every other civilization in the eastern Mediterranean, and hollowed out by economic crisis, administrative corruption, and institutional decay from within. He had built the most fortified temple in all of Egypt, a monument whose massive defensive walls told a story of insecurity and vulnerability that the victory inscriptions on those same walls did their best to deny. And he had been murdered, killed by conspirators from his own household, by members of his own harem, by a secondary wife named Tie, who wanted her son Pentawere to inherit the throne instead of the pharaoh's chosen heir. The numbers are striking. 31 years on the throne, at least 3 major military campaigns against foreign invaders, the first recorded labor strike in human history, a conspiracy involving at least 40 named conspirators, a wound 70 millimeters wide, a prosthetic toe fashioned from linen and resin by embalmers who wanted to send their murdered king into the afterlife with his body intact, a pathetic, touching, and ultimately futile gesture of care for a man who had been butchered by the people he trusted. The embalmers had done their best to conceal the evidence of the assassination, covering the throat wound with thick layers of linen, inserting the healing amulet into the gash, fashioning the false toe to replace the one that had been hacked away, as though the rituals of preservation could undo the violence of the murder, as though the careful wrapping of the corpse could restore the royal dignity that the assassins had so violently stripped away. And a story that reads like a thriller, a story of war and betrayal, of military triumph and economic collapse, of heroic defense and domestic treachery, of a man who spent his entire extraordinary reign trying to hold together a civilization that was falling apart around him, and who succeeded on every battlefield and in every military campaign, only to be destroyed by the enemy he could not fight, the enemy that was already inside the walls, already seated at the table, already planning the assassination that would end the life of the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who Ramesses III was, not the simplified last great pharaoh of the textbook summaries, but the specific, complex, deeply human, and historically consequential ruler who inherited a kingdom in crisis, who defended it against the most dangerous military threat it had ever faced, who watched it decline despite his best efforts, and who died at the hands of the people he trusted most. You are going to understand what he built: the massive fortified temple of Medinet Habu, one of the largest and most detailed monuments in all of Egypt. You are going to understand what he saved: the Egyptian civilization itself, the last surviving great power of the Bronze Age, the civilization that every other empire in the Eastern Mediterranean had failed to preserve. You are going to understand what he lost, and what his story tells us about the extraordinary fragility of civilization and the terrible, exhausting, and often heartbreaking price of holding it together. The Pharaoh's story is preserved in stone and papyrus, in forensic evidence and court documents, in temple reliefs and mummy wrappings, a story that has been pieced together over more than a century of archaeological investigation, scholarly analysis, and scientific research, and that continues to yield new insights and new revelations as modern technology provides tools that the earliest Egyptologists could not have imagined. The 2012 CT scan study, published in the British Medical Journal in December of that year, authored by Zahi Hawass and Sahar Salim and their colleagues, was a landmark moment in the study of the pharaonic mummies, a moment that transformed our understanding of Ramesses III's death, and that demonstrated the extraordinary power of modern forensic science to reveal truths that the ancient embalmers had spent 3 millennia concealing. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The story of Ramesses III is not merely the story of a pharaoh. It is the story of an entire civilization at the moment of its greatest crisis. The story of the last stand of the Bronze Age world against the forces that would destroy it, and the story of a man who won every battle except the one that mattered most. The wound tells a story, the walls tell a story, the empty granaries and the striking workers, and the judicial papyri, and the mummy wrapped in linen, and the amulet pressed into severed flesh. They all tell a story, and the story is this: that the civilization was genuinely great, and the pharaoh was genuinely great, and the victories were genuinely real, and the monuments were magnificent, and none of it was enough. None of it was enough to prevent the slow, grinding, and ultimately irresistible decline that would consume the last great age of ancient Egypt, and that would leave behind only the temples, the tombs, the inscriptions, and the mummy of a murdered king. Now, let us begin. The world into which Ramesses III ascended the throne was a world in collapse. The great Bronze Age civilization that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, the interconnected network of empires, kingdoms, city-states, and trade routes that had linked Egypt to the Hittites, to Babylon, to Assyria, to the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, to the copper-rich island of Cyprus, and to the trading cities of the Levantine coast, was disintegrating. The Hittite Empire, which had been Egypt's principal rival and diplomatic partner for more than a century, had fallen. Its capital, Hattusa, had been burned. Its vassal states had been overrun. The great trading cities of the Levantine coast, Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, were being sacked, one after another, by waves of migrating and marauding peoples, whom the Egyptian texts called the Sea Peoples. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece had collapsed. The trade networks that had carried copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, gold from Nubia, grain from Egypt, and luxury goods from every corner of the ancient world had been disrupted, degraded, and in many cases completely destroyed. The collapse was not instantaneous. It unfolded over decades, a slow-motion catastrophe that rolled across the entire Eastern Mediterranean like a devastating wave, toppling one civilization after another, destroying the political, economic, diplomatic, and cultural structures that had sustained the region for centuries, and that had made the Eastern Mediterranean one of the most interconnected and most prosperous regions on Earth. The causes of the collapse have been debated by scholars for decades, and no single explanation has gained universal acceptance. Some scholars emphasize climatic change, a prolonged drought that struck the Eastern Mediterranean in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, disrupting agricultural production, depleting food supplies, and setting in motion the population movements that would eventually destroy the established order. Other scholars emphasize the disruption of the tin trade, the supply of tin from Afghanistan and Central Asia that was essential for the production of bronze, the essential alloy from which the weapons, the tools, and the luxury goods of the Bronze Age civilization were manufactured. Still others emphasize political factors, the internal weaknesses of the great empires, the rivalries between competing factions within the ruling elites, the growing, steadily widening, and increasingly dangerous disconnect between the palace economies and the ordinary populations they governed. The most likely explanation is that all of these factors, climatic, economic, political, and military, interacted and reinforced each other, creating a cascading failure that no single cause could have produced, and that no single solution could have prevented. Modern scholars call it the Bronze Age collapse, one of the most devastating, most geographically comprehensive, most institutionally destructive, and most historically consequential civilizational catastrophes in the entire history of the human species. A collapse so comprehensive, so geographically widespread, so economically destructive, and so institutionally devastating that it plunged the entire Eastern Mediterranean world into a dark age that lasted for centuries, a period during which writing declined or disappeared, trade networks collapsed, urban centers were abandoned, and the accumulated knowledge, the institutional sophistication, the artistic traditions, the literary achievements, the scientific understanding, and the diplomatic conventions of the Bronze Age world were lost, forgotten, or severely diminished. The Dark Age that followed the collapse lasted, in many regions, for centuries, a period during which the population of the Eastern Mediterranean declined, the complexity of social organization decreased, and the material standard of living fell to levels that had not been seen for hundreds of years. The contrast between the Bronze Age world and the post-collapse world was stark and deeply revealing. The Bronze Age had been an era of magnificent palaces, of international trade, of diplomatic correspondence, of elaborate art and architecture. The post-collapse world was an era of small, isolated villages, of local subsistence farming, of isolation and impoverishment, of communities that had lost contact with the wider world and that had forgotten the achievements of their predecessors. Egypt was the exception, the one major Bronze Age civilization that survived the collapse, the one great power that endured, battered and diminished, but still functioning, still governed, still capable of maintaining a level of social organization and cultural production that the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean had lost. And the man who held Egypt together, the man who fought the battles and made the decisions that kept the Egyptian state alive during the most dangerous period in its history, was the Pharaoh whose mummy would, 3,000 years later, reveal the terrible secret of his death. The scale of the collapse was staggering. Within a single generation, within the span of a single human lifetime, the entire political, economic, diplomatic, and commercial infrastructure of the Eastern Mediterranean world had been dismantled, destroyed, disrupted, or rendered completely and irreparably dysfunctional. The great palace economies that had organized the production, the distribution, and the consumption of goods across vast territories had ceased to function. The diplomatic correspondence that had connected the courts of the great powers, the letters of the Amarna archive, the treaty documents of the Hittite archives, had fallen silent. The maritime trade routes that had carried copper ingots from Cyprus, precious cedar wood from Lebanon, olive oil from the Aegean, and luxury goods from every corner of the known world had been disrupted by piracy and warfare, to the point where long-distance maritime commerce had largely ceased. The Eastern Mediterranean, which had been one of the most economically interconnected and culturally sophisticated regions on Earth, was reverting to a fragmented, isolated, and impoverished landscape of small, defensive communities that had lost contact with each other and with the wider world. Egypt was the last great power standing. It was the only major Bronze Age civilization that survived the collapse, battered, weakened, diminished, and fundamentally changed by the loss of its international trade networks, its Levantine territories, and its position as the preeminent power of the Eastern Mediterranean, but still functioning, still governed by a pharaoh, still defended by an army, still administered by a bureaucracy, still capable of projecting military force and maintaining internal order. And the man who held it together, the new kingdom, the era of the great pharaohs, the era of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III and Amenhotep III and Akhenaten and Tutankhamun and Seti and Ramesses the Great, was, by the time of Ramesses III's accession, entering its final phase. The military and economic structures that had sustained the empire for 3 centuries were weakening. The artistic and cultural achievements of the 18th dynasty were receding into memory. The diplomatic relationships that had connected Egypt to the other great powers of the ancient Near East were dissolving along with the powers themselves. And the man who stood between the collapsing world and the abyss, who fought the battles and managed the crises and made the decisions that determined whether the Egyptian civilization would survive or join the Hittites and the Mycenaeans in extinction, was Ramesses III. Ramesses III was not born into the main line of the Ramesside dynasty. His father, Setnakht, was the founder of the 20th dynasty, a man whose origins are obscure, whose family background is uncertain, and whose relationship to the preceding 19th dynasty is a matter of scholarly debate. Some scholars believe that Setnakht was a grandson of Ramesses II, a distant member of the Ramesside family who had maintained a prominent position within the military establishment and who had the connections, the resources, and the authority to seize power when the 19th dynasty collapsed into political chaos. Other scholars believe that Setnakht was not related to the Ramessids at all, that he was a military strongman, a commander who had risen through the ranks of the army and who had seized the throne by force during a period of political vacuum and institutional breakdown. The uncertainty about Setnakht's origins is itself significant. It tells us something about the chaos of the late 19th dynasty and about the disruption of the normal and established mechanisms of pharaonic succession that the political crisis had so thoroughly, so violently, and so damagingly disrupted. The circumstances of Setnakht's rise to power are poorly understood. The sources from this period are fragmentary and contradictory, and the precise sequence of events that led to the fall of the 19th dynasty and the founding of the 20th remains one of the most debated topics in the study of the late New Kingdom. What is clear is that Setnakht had seized power during a period of intense political chaos at the end of the 19th dynasty, a period that saw rival claimants to the throne, civil conflict, and the brief reign of a queen regnant named Twosret, whose authority was challenged and ultimately overthrown. The chaos of the late 19th dynasty, the rival claimants, the political murders, the brief and contested reign of Queen Twosret, had left the Egyptian state in a condition of acute and dangerous vulnerability at precisely the moment when the external threats were intensifying and the institutional capacity to detect, to prepare for, to coordinate a response to, and to effectively address those threats was diminishing with alarming and accelerating speed. Setnakht's seizure of power was in many ways a last resort rescue operation, an attempt by a strong, decisive, militarily experienced, and politically astute military leader to restore order to a kingdom that was descending into political fragmentation at the worst possible moment in the entire history of the Egyptian state, when the external threats were mounting with terrifying speed and the internal structures were weakening with equally alarming rapidity. The founding of the 20th dynasty by Setnakht was, in many ways, the last successful act of political renewal that the Egyptian state would experience during the New Kingdom period. The new dynasty was established not through the normal mechanisms of hereditary succession, but through the forceful seizure of power by a military leader who recognized that the existing political order was collapsing into chaos and who took it upon himself to restore stability, order, and institutional functionality, and to defend the kingdom against the threats that were gathering on every frontier. Setnakht's reign was brief, perhaps only 2 or 3 years, and it was his son, Ramesses III, who would bear the full weight of the crisis that the new dynasty had been founded to address. Ramesses was crowned at Karnak and established his residence at the old Ramesside capital of Pi Ramesses in the Nile Delta. On the very day of his accession, he ordered the construction of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu on the west bank at Thebes, a temple that would become the most important monument of his reign, the primary and most detailed source for our understanding of his military campaigns and his domestic policies, and one of the largest, most architecturally complex, most richly decorated, and best preserved temples in all of Egypt. The construction of Medinet Habu was one of the most ambitious building projects of the late New Kingdom, a project that would occupy the artisans of Deir el-Medina for much of Ramesses's reign, and that would produce one of the most architecturally impressive, most historically informative, and most archaeologically valuable monuments in the entire Nile Valley. The temple's reliefs, inscriptions, and architectural design have provided scholars with an unparalleled window into the military, political, economic, and social history of the late New Kingdom. A window that is all the more precious and historically valuable because the period it illuminates is one of the most poorly documented and yet one of the most historically consequential in the entire 3,000-year history of the Egyptian pharaonic state. The temple was deliberately modelled on the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple of Ramesses II, a deliberate and politically calculated effort to associate the new pharaoh with the greatest, most powerful, and most celebrated of his predecessors, and to claim, through architectural imitation, the legitimacy and the prestige that the 20th dynasty's uncertain origins might otherwise have denied him. The new pharaoh was a man of remarkable energy and determination, qualities that the unprecedented and deepening crisis of his times demanded, and that Ramesses would demonstrate repeatedly and convincingly over the course of his 3-decade reign. He was also a man of considerable political intelligence, who understood that the legitimacy of his dynasty, a dynasty whose origins were uncertain and whose founder had seized power by force rather than inheriting it through the normal mechanisms of succession, depended on the visible and dramatic exercise of pharaonic authority. The building of Medinet Habu, the military campaigns, the religious donations, and the elaborate ceremonial life of the court were all part of a comprehensive strategy to establish the 20th dynasty's credibility and to demonstrate that the new pharaoh was worthy of the throne he occupied. The resources that Ramesses inherited were substantial but not unlimited. Egypt remained the wealthiest state in the eastern Mediterranean. Its agricultural productivity, sustained by the annual flooding of the Nile, was the highest in the region, and its gold mines in Nubia continued to produce the precious metal that was the foundation of international trade and diplomatic exchange. The Egyptian army, though it had deteriorated during the final years of the 19th dynasty, was still the most experienced and the most institutionally sophisticated military force in the ancient world. The administrative apparatus, the network of scribes, officials, governors, and tax collectors who managed the daily business of governance across the vast territory of the Nile Valley and the Delta, was still functional, still capable of mobilizing resources and coordinating the complex logistics that the defense of the empire, the management of its far-flung territories, and the coordination of its military campaigns required. But the resources were under pressure from the severe and ongoing economic disruptions caused by the sudden collapse of the international trade networks, pressure from the growing and increasingly urgent demands of the military establishment, pressure from the expanding temple estates that consumed an ever larger share of the kingdom's agricultural surplus. The pharaoh who ascended the throne in 1186 BC was not inheriting an empire at its peak. He was inheriting an empire under siege from multiple, simultaneous, and increasingly dangerous directions, an empire that was being attacked from without by increasingly dangerous foreign invaders, and eroded from within by economic and institutional decline. The early years of Ramesses's reign were devoted to consolidation, the restoration of political order and institutional stability after the chaos and the violence of the late 19th dynasty, the systematic rebuilding of the military establishment, the reorganization and the reinvigoration of the administrative apparatus, and the urgent preparation for the threats that the pharaoh knew were coming. the threats arrived sooner than anyone might have hoped. In the 5th year of his reign, approximately 1182 BC, the Libyans launched a major and well-organized invasion of Egypt's western border. The Meshwesh and the Libu, the same powerful, numerous, well-organized, and militarily aggressive tribal confederations that had attacked Egypt under the pharaoh Meneptah a generation earlier, pushed aggressively eastward into the delta, seeking to settle on the fertile and abundantly productive agricultural land that the Nile's annual flood made the most productive in the region. Ramesses met the Libyan invasion with the decisive military force, the tactical skill, the organizational efficiency, and the strategic competence that would characterize his entire distinguished military career. The pharaoh mobilized the Egyptian army in its entirety, marched west to confront the invaders, and defeated the Libyans in a battle that was commemorated on the walls of Medinet Habu, and that established the new pharaoh's reputation as a competent and aggressive military commander. The victory over the Libyans in year 5 was significant. It demonstrated the military capability of the new dynasty, and it secured Egypt's western frontier at a time when the eastern Mediterranean world was in chaos. But the victory was also a warning. The Libyans would return again and again and again throughout the remaining decades of Ramesses's reign, each invasion larger and more dangerous than the last, each one requiring the mobilization of increasingly scarce and increasingly expensive military resources to repel and to defeat. The western frontier would remain a chronic source of insecurity throughout the 20th dynasty, and the Libyan pressure on the delta would eventually result, centuries later, in the establishment of Libyan dynasties that ruled Egypt during the Third Intermediate Period. The Libyan campaigns of Ramesses's reign, the first in year 5, additional campaigns in subsequent years, were themselves a significant drain on the Egyptian military establishment, requiring the mobilization of troops, the deployment of chariotry, the organization of supply lines, and the expenditure of resources that the Egyptian economy, already severely strained by the disruption of its international trade networks and the loss of its Levantine revenues, could ill afford to spare. Each campaign was successful. Ramesses proved himself a capable and aggressive military commander who could defeat the Libyan tribes in open battle. But each campaign also consumed resources that were desperately and urgently needed elsewhere, and each victory was followed, after an interval of years, by another Libyan incursion that required another military response. The Libyan threat was, in many ways, the chronic condition of Ramesses's reign, a persistent, recurring, increasingly expensive, and resource-draining military challenge that demanded constant attention and constant expenditure, even as the far more dangerous and far more existentially threatening Sea People's Crisis was developing to the northeast. The Libyans were not seeking to destroy the Egyptian civilization. They were seeking to share in its prosperity, to settle on the fertile agricultural land of the Western Delta, to integrate themselves into the Egyptian economy and the Egyptian social order. But the scale of the Libyan migration threatened to overwhelm the capacity of the Egyptian state to absorb, to integrate, and to effectively control the newcomers, and Ramesses's decision to meet the Libyan incursions with military force was a reflection of his clear-eyed understanding that large-scale uncontrolled migration, if left unchecked, could be as destabilizing as outright invasion. The western frontier was a wound that would not heal, a chronic source of insecurity that drained the Egyptian state of the military resources it needed to address the far more dangerous threat that was approaching from the east. But the Libyan invasion of year 5 was merely the opening act. The Libyan campaigns taught Ramesses important lessons about the nature of the threats that Egypt faced and about the strategies that would be needed to address them. The Libyans were a conventional enemy, tribal warriors who fought in traditional formations and who could be defeated by the superior training, equipment, and organization of the Egyptian army. The Sea Peoples would be a different kind of enemy, a migrating nation under arms, a population on the move, a force that combined formidable and battle-tested military capability with overwhelming demographic pressure in a way that the Egyptian military establishment, for all its centuries of experience, and its formidable institutional sophistication had never previously encountered. The lessons of the Libyan campaigns, the importance of early detection, the value of meeting the enemy as far from the Egyptian heartland as possible, the necessity of overwhelming force and decisive engagement, would prove absolutely invaluable when the much more dangerous and much more existentially threatening challenge of the Sea Peoples materialized 3 years later. The real crisis, the existential threat that would define Ramesses's reign and that would determine the fate of the last surviving Bronze Age civilization, was still approaching. In the 8th year of Ramesses's reign, approximately 1178 BC, the Sea Peoples arrived. They came not as raiders, not as pirates, not as mercenaries seeking employment in the service of a wealthy state, but as a migrating nation under arms, an entire population on the move, men, women, children, livestock, household goods, travelling in ox-drawn carts along the Levantine coast, and in fleets of ships across the eastern Mediterranean, seeking new lands to settle, new territories to conquer, new civilizations to supplant. They had already destroyed every power in their path, a catalogue of destruction that the Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu enumerate with chilling specificity. The Hittite Empire, the great power of Anatolia, the rival that had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh and had then signed a peace treaty that had brought decades of stability to the eastern Mediterranean, was gone. Its capital, Hattusa, lay in ashes. Its royal archives, which had preserved the diplomatic correspondence of generations, were scattered. Its vassal states had been overrun. The kingdom of Ugarit, the wealthy trading city on the Syrian coast that had served as a commercial hub connecting the Mediterranean to the ancient Near East, had been destroyed. A letter found in the ruins of Ugarit, written by the city's king to the king of Alashia on the eve of the city's destruction, pleads desperately for help. The city's army is in the Hittite lands. The city's fleet is in Lycia. The city is defenseless. The letter was never answered. The city was burned. The kingdom of Amuru, the strategic buffer state between the Hittite and Egyptian empires, had fallen. The island of Alashia, identified with Cyprus, had been overrun. One by one, the dominoes had fallen, and now the last domino, Egypt, was in the crosshairs. They had already destroyed every major power in their path. Every kingdom, every empire, every city-state, every trading centre. The Hittite Empire was gone. The city of Ugarit was gone. The kingdom of Amuru was gone. The coastal cities of the Levant were burning. The Sea Peoples had swept southward along the coast like a wildfire, consuming everything in their path. The chronology of the catastrophe can be traced through the archaeological record and through the fragmentary texts that have survived from the final decades of the Bronze Age world. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient Near East, an empire that had rivaled Egypt for political and military control of the Levant, and that had signed the first known peace treaty in recorded history with Ramesses II, fell sometime around 1180 BC, its capital Hattusa burned and abandoned, its royal archives scattered, its administrative structures completely dismantled. The city of Ugarit, the wealthy trading port on the Syrian coast that had served as a vital commercial hub connecting the Mediterranean maritime trade networks to the overland caravan routes of the Near East, was destroyed at approximately the same time. Its population killed or dispersed, its magnificent library of cuneiform tablets buried beneath the rubble of the burning city. A letter found in the ruins of Ugarit, written by the city's last king to the king of Alashia, captures the desperation of the final days. The city's fleet is away in Lycia. The city's army is away in the Hittite territories. The city is completely defenseless. The enemy's ships have been spotted offshore. The letter was never answered. The city was destroyed, its population killed or scattered. The kingdom ceased to exist. And now the Sea Peoples, the confederation of displaced, desperate and militarily formidable peoples who had wrought this unprecedented, catastrophic and devastating destruction, were at the gates of Egypt, the last great prize, the final glittering target, the wealthiest and most powerful state remaining in the ancient world, the final remaining obstacle between the Sea Peoples and the complete domination of the eastern Mediterranean. The Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu, the most detailed and the most historically significant military texts to survive from the ancient world, describe the crisis in stark, uncompromising, and profoundly alarming language. Ramesses himself, speaking through the inscriptions that his scribes carved into the temple walls, declared, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Karchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that, which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Peliset, Jekka, Shekelesh, Jenyan, and Weshesh, lands united. The Confederation of the Sea Peoples included groups whose identities scholars have debated for more than a century. The identities of the Sea Peoples, the specific ethnic, linguistic, and cultural origins of the groups that formed the Confederation, have been one of the most debated topics in the study of the ancient Mediterranean world for more than a century of intensive, scholarly investigation. The debate is complicated by the fact that the Egyptian sources are the primary evidence for the Sea Peoples' existence, and the Egyptian scribes described foreign peoples in terms that reflected Egyptian categories and Egyptian perceptions, rather than the self-identifications of the peoples themselves. Nevertheless, certain identifications have gained broad scholarly acceptance. The Peliset are widely identified with the Philistines, the people who would eventually settle on the southern coast of the Levant and give their name to the land of Palestine. The Jekka are associated with the city of Dor on the Levantine coast. The Shekelesh may have been connected to Sicily. The Denyen may have been related to the Danans of Greek tradition, the same people whom the Greek poet Homer would later immortalize in the Iliad, the warriors who Sojimis, and who returned home to find their own world in ruins. The Weshesh remain largely unidentified. Their name appears in the Egyptian texts, but has not been convincingly linked to any known archaeological or historical entity. A mystery within a mystery, an unresolved and perhaps permanently unresolvable scholarly question within an already deeply mysterious and endlessly debated historical episode. Together, they formed a coalition of displaced, desperate, and militarily formidable peoples who had been set in motion by the same complex, interrelated, and mutually reinforcing forces of political collapse, economic disruption, demographic displacement, environmental degradation, and climatic stress that were systematically destroying the Bronze Age world. Peoples who had been violently and permanently displaced from their homelands, and who were seeking, with the fierce and absolute determination of those who have nothing left to lose, nothing to return to, and nothing to hope for except the conquest of new territories in which to build new lives, new communities, and new futures for their families and their children. The desperation of the Sea Peoples was itself a formidable and terrifying weapon. It gave them a ferocity and a willingness to accept casualties that a conventional army, fighting for territory or tribute or political advantage, would not have possessed. The Sea Peoples fought not for conquest but for survival, and the survival instinct, the knowledge that defeat meant extinction, that there was no homeland to return to, that victory was the only alternative to annihilation, made them extraordinarily dangerous opponents. The intelligence that reached the Egyptian court about the Sea Peoples' advance along the Levantine coast must have been genuinely terrifying. The reports, carried by terrified refugees, by displaced merchants, by diplomatic messengers fleeing the destruction of their cities, described a force unlike anything the experienced and battle-hardened Egyptian military establishment had previously encountered or prepared for. The Sea Peoples were not a conventional army. They were an entire population on the move, a nation under arms, a migration of displaced and desperate peoples who had already destroyed every obstacle in their path, and who were approaching Egypt with the supreme confidence of those who had already conquered the known world. The reports describe the destruction of the Hittite Empire, the complete sacking and destruction of Ugarit, the burning and overrunning of Amuru, the devastation of the entire Levantine coast, a cascade of catastrophes and destructions that was rolling inexorably southward toward the Egyptian frontier, with what must have seemed like unstoppable momentum. The Sea People's advance along the Levantine coast had been preceded by a wave of destruction that left a trail of burned and sacked cities, displaced and desperate populations, and collapsed political structures stretching from Anatolia to the borders of Egypt. The archaeological record of the Levantine coast in the late 12th century BC tells a story of systematic destruction. Layer after layer of ash and rubble in the excavation trenches of the coastal cities, evidence of fierce fires that consumed buildings, palaces, storehouses, and temples, evidence of populations that fled in panic or were killed, evidence of a catastrophe that was not merely military, but profoundly and comprehensively civilizational, destroying not merely the cities but the entire political, economic, and cultural framework that had sustained urban life in the region for centuries. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented in the history of the Eastern Mediterranean. No previous military campaign, not the campaigns of the Egyptian pharaohs, not the expansion of the Hittite Empire, not the piracy and the raiding that had always been a feature of Mediterranean life, had produced devastation on this scale. The Sea Peoples were not merely conquerors, they were destroyers, a force that did not merely defeat its enemies but obliterated them, replacing the established order, not with a new order, but with chaos, with displacement, with the vacant silence of abandoned cities and depopulated landscapes. Ramesses understood that the threat was existential, that the Sea People's invasion was not merely a military challenge but a civilizational crisis, a fateful confrontation between the last surviving, still functioning, and still militarily capable Bronze Age empire and the overwhelming forces of migration, displacement, civilizational destruction, and demographic upheaval that had already consumed every other great power in the Eastern Mediterranean region. The pharaoh's response was comprehensive and strategically brilliant. He prepared a two-part defense, a land army to meet the Sea People's ground forces as they advanced southward along the Levantine coast, and a naval force to intercept their fleet as it attempted to enter the mouths of the Nile. The decision to fight the Sea Peoples at Jai, to march the Egyptian army northward out of Egypt proper, and to engage the enemy on foreign soil, in a region that had already been devastated by the Sea People's advance, was a bold and strategically significant choice. Ramesses understood that the destruction of the Sea People's land forces before they reached the Egyptian frontier would be far easier and far less costly than fighting them in the delta itself, where the invaders might be able to seize the agricultural resources that they needed to sustain their migration. The decision to fight at Jai was a carefully considered and deliberately calculated risk. If the Egyptian army had been defeated, the road to the Egyptian heartland would have been wide open, and the kingdom would have been virtually defenseless against the Sea People's advance. But it was a risk that reflected the pharaoh's confidence in his forces and his understanding that defensive warfare conducted on the Egyptian frontier rather than in the Egyptian heartland offered the best chance of a decisive victory. The land battle was fought at Jahai, a location in the region of modern-day southern Lebanon, on the easternmost frontier of the Egyptian Empire. Ramesses had boldly moved his army northward, out of the relative safety and the familiar terrain of the Egyptian heartland, and into the contested and dangerous territory of the Levantine coast, to intercept the Sea Peoples before they could reach the Egyptian heartland. A strategic decision that demonstrated both his considerable and well-founded confidence in the training and the capability of his forces and his strategic understanding that the best defense was to meet the enemy as far from Egypt's borders as possible. The Egyptian army, a combined force of infantry, chariotry, and the devastating massed archers who were the most lethal component of the Egyptian military establishment, engaged the Sea People's land forces in a fierce and bloody battle that the Medinet Habu reliefs depict in vivid and sometimes gruesome detail. Egyptian chariots charging into the enemy ranks with devastating speed and force, the chariot warriors hurling javelins and firing arrows from their mobile platforms at the massed ranks of the enemy infantry, while the horses trampled the fallen and the wounded beneath their hooves. Egyptian archers, the most lethal, the most experienced, and the most tactically flexible component of the entire Egyptian military establishment, raining volley after volley of arrows on the advancing columns of Sea People's warriors. Hand-to-hand combat between Egyptian infantry and the distinctive feather-helmeted warriors of the Peliset and the Jekka. The Battle of Jahi was one of the defining military engagements of the ancient world, a confrontation between the last surviving Bronze Age empire and the forces of displacement and destruction that had already consumed every other great power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Egyptian army's performance at the Battle of Jahi was a powerful and historically significant testament to the quality of the military training, the sophistication of the tactical doctrine, and the effectiveness of the command structure that the Egyptian state had developed and maintained over centuries of warfare in the Levant and in Nubia. The combined arms approach that Ramesses employed, the carefully coordinated use of chariotry, infantry, and archers in an integrated and mutually supporting tactical system, was the product of many generations of hard-won military experience, accumulated tactical knowledge, and continuous institutional refinement, and it proved devastatingly effective against the Sea People's less organized and less tactically sophisticated forces. The Medinet Habu reliefs depict the chaos and the violence of the battle with a specificity and a dramatic intensity that is unmatched in Egyptian military art. The scenes show the distinctive feather-helmeted warriors of the Pelset and the Jekka engaging Egyptian infantry in hand-to-hand combat, their swords and spears clashing with the shields and weapons of the Egyptian soldiers. The scenes show the ox-drawn carts of the Sea People's migrating families, women and children visible in the carts, caught in the crossfire of a battle that was simultaneously a military engagement and a humanitarian catastrophe. The scenes show Egyptian chariots running down, fleeing enemy warriors, Egyptian archers picking off targets at close range, and the bodies of the dead and the wounded littering the battlefield. The battle was brutal, chaotic, extraordinarily violent, and utterly unforgiving, but the Egyptian forces prevailed. The Sea People's land army was defeated, scattered, and driven back, and it gets worse for the Sea Peoples. The naval battle was even more devastating. Ramesses had prepared a trap. He had stationed his warships, galleys, and coastal vessels at the mouths of the Nile, manning them from bow to stern with armed marines and archers. He had also positioned archers on the riverbanks, creating a killing zone that the Sea People's fleet would have to pass through in order to reach the delta. The naval defense of the Nile Delta was Ramesses's tactical masterpiece, a tactical operation of extraordinary ingenuity and devastating effectiveness that demonstrated the pharaoh's strategic vision and his willingness to use every advantage that the geography of the Nile Delta offered. The plan was simple in conception but brilliant in execution. Rather than meeting the Sea People's fleet in the open sea, where the invaders' ships and sailors might have had the advantage, Ramesses lured the enemy fleet into the narrow, shallow channels of the Nile Delta, where the Egyptian forces, warships designed for river combat, archers positioned on the riverbanks, marines trained for close-quarters fighting, held every possible tactical advantage. Familiarity with the terrain, superiority in close-quarters combat, and the ability to coordinate their land and naval forces in an integrated and devastatingly effective tactical system that the Sea People's less organized forces could not match. The inscription at Medinet Habu describes the preparation in Ramesses's own words. "I had the river mouths prepared like a strong wall, with warships, galleys, and coasters, equipped from bow to stern, with brave warriors carrying their weapons. When the Sea People's fleet entered the Nile channels, they sailed into a trap. The Egyptian warships, designed for river combat, maneuverable in the narrow, winding channels of the delta, closed with the enemy vessels and grappled them, boarding the Sea People's ships, while the archers on the banks poured volleys of arrows into the enemy fleet from both sides. The Sea People's ships, designed for the open sea, were at a disadvantage in the narrow channels. They were significantly less maneuverable, far more vulnerable to the devastating and relentless missile fire of the Egyptian archers, and unable to escape the close-quarters combat that the Egyptian marines excelled at. The trap was devastating in its effectiveness and merciless in its execution. The Sea People's ships, designed for open water sailing, were caught in the narrow, shallow channels of the delta, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, unable to bring their full strength and their full complement of warriors to bear. The Egyptian marines, trained specifically for river combat, accustomed to the unique challenges and the specialized techniques of fighting in close quarters on the slippery, blood-soaked, and unstable decks of ships, armed with swords, spears, and shields, swarmed aboard the enemy vessels and cut down the Sea People's warriors in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. The archers on the riverbanks continued to pour arrows into the enemy fleet, creating a devastating and inescapable crossfire that left the Sea People's ships caught between the Egyptian warships in the channels ahead and the Egyptian archers on the shores to either side, a killing zone from which there was absolutely no escape and no possibility of retreat. The result was a massacre. The Sea People's fleet was destroyed, its ships sunk or captured, its crews killed or taken prisoner. The victory in the naval battle of the Delta was one of the most decisive, most tactically brilliant, and most historically consequential naval engagements in the entire history of the ancient world. A battle that destroyed the Sea People's capacity for maritime warfare and that eliminated the threat of a seaborne invasion of the Egyptian Delta. The Egyptian Navy, which had been assembled, equipped, and positioned with remarkable speed and organizational efficiency, had demonstrated a capacity for naval warfare that no other Mediterranean state could match, and the tactical brilliance of the trap that Ramesses had set for the enemy fleet had exploited every advantage that the geography of the Nile Delta offered. The aftermath of the battle was itself significant. The surviving Sea Peoples, those who had not been killed in the fighting, and who had been taken prisoner by the Egyptian forces, were settled on Egyptian land, given territories to farm, and integrated into the Egyptian military establishment as auxiliary troops. The settlement of the defeated Sea Peoples on Egyptian territory was a pragmatic solution to a practical problem. The prisoners needed to be housed and fed, and the Egyptian state needed soldiers and farmers to replace the losses that the military campaigns had inflicted on its own population. But the settlement also had profound, far-reaching, and historically transformative long-term consequences. It introduced new populations, new cultures, and new loyalties into the Egyptian social fabric, creating communities that owed their existence to the pharaoh's mercy, but that maintained their own cultural identities and their own communal organizations within the larger framework of the Egyptian state. The relief at Medinet Habu depicts the aftermath with chilling clarity. Egyptian soldiers dragging bound prisoners from overturned ships, counting severed hands from the dead, presenting the captured enemy to the pharaoh in a formal ceremony of triumph. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The victory over the Sea Peoples was genuine. It was a decisive military triumph that saved Egypt from the fate that had befallen every other great power in the eastern Mediterranean. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The military campaigns drained the Egyptian treasury. The defense of the kingdom consumed resources that were needed for the maintenance of the temples, the payment of the workers, the administration of the provinces, and the upkeep of the infrastructure that the Egyptian state depended upon. Ramesses had saved the civilization, but the act of saving it had exacted a terrible price. The military campaigns had consumed enormous quantities of resources: gold, copper, grain, manpower, administrative capacity, that were desperately needed for the maintenance of the domestic economy and the upkeep of the institutional structures that held the civilization together. The defense of the borders had come at the expense of the maintenance of the interior, a trade-off that was perhaps inevitable, given the severity of the external threat, but that would prove, in the long term, to be catastrophic for the stability and the viability of the Egyptian state. The cost of victory was measured not merely in gold and grain, but in institutional capacity, in the erosion of the administrative structures, the depletion of the trained personnel, the deterioration of the infrastructure, and the accumulation of deferred maintenance that would, over the following decades, cripple the Egyptian state's ability to govern effectively, to collect taxes efficiently, to distribute resources fairly, and to maintain the social contract between the pharaoh and his people that was the very foundation of the entire pharaonic order. Ramesses had won the war against the Sea Peoples, but the victory had weakened the Egyptian state, perhaps fatally, and the decades that followed the great victory would see the slow, grinding, painful, and ultimately irreversible decline of the kingdom that Ramesses had fought so hard and so successfully to preserve. The resources that had been consumed by the military campaigns could not be replaced. The trade networks that had been destroyed by the Bronze Age collapse could not be rebuilt. The territorial losses that the collapse had inflicted on the Egyptian Empire, the loss of the Levantine vassals and their agricultural productivity, the loss of the trade routes and their commercial revenues, the loss of the tribute that had flowed into the Egyptian treasury from the conquered territories, were permanent, and the economic consequences of those territorial and commercial losses would compound steadily over time, weakening the state with each passing year, each passing month, and each passing season, and making it increasingly and ultimately impossibly difficult for the pharaoh and his successors to maintain the extraordinary level of institutional expenditure that the Egyptian pharaonic system required. The military victory over the Sea Peoples was, in this sense, a Pyrrhic victory, a victory that was genuine and that was necessary, but that came at a cost that the Egyptian state could not afford, and that accelerated the very decline that the victory had been intended to prevent. Ramesses had saved the civilization from external destruction, but he had not and could not save it from the internal deterioration that the enormous cost of salvation had imposed. The mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu is in many ways the most eloquent monument to the paradox of Ramesses's reign, a temple that celebrates military triumph while simultaneously providing evidence of the civilization's decline. The temple complex covers an enormous area on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, a sprawling compound of courtyards, hypostyle halls, pylons, subsidiary temples, storage magazines, administrative offices, and residential quarters that functioned not merely as a mortuary temple but as a fortified administrative center, a military headquarters, and a palace from which the pharaoh governed the Theban region. The fortifications are, for the modern scholar, the most revealing and the most historically significant architectural feature of the entire complex. The decision to fortify the temple, to surround a religious and administrative complex with the kind of defensive architecture that had previously been reserved for military installations on the frontier, was unprecedented in the history of Egyptian temple construction and is one of the most revealing indicators of the deteriorating security situation in the Theban region during Ramesses's reign. Previous pharaohs had built their mortuary temples as open, accessible religious institutions, monuments designed to impress with their architectural grandeur and their artistic refinement, not to defend against attack. The fact that Ramesses felt it necessary to enclose Medinet Habu within fortified walls tells us something that no inscription on the temple's walls explicitly says, that the pharaoh no longer felt confident that the traditional structures of Egyptian society, the respect for religious institutions, the authority of the pharaoh's name, the rule of law, were sufficient to protect his temple and his person from the threats that the deepening economic and social crisis of the late 20th dynasty was generating. No previous Egyptian temple had ever been enclosed within such massive defensive walls. The architectural design of Medinet Habu reflects the dual nature of Ramesses's reign, a reign that was simultaneously and paradoxically a period of military triumph and institutional decline, a period in which the pharaoh celebrated his military victories on the temple walls while simultaneously fortifying his temple against the internal threats that those external victories could not eliminate. The Migdal Gate, the massive fortified entrance to the temple complex, modelled on the Syrian military architecture that the Egyptians had encountered during their campaigns in the Levant, is a structure that would have been more appropriate for a military fortress on the frontier of the empire than for a religious monument in the heart of the Theban necropolis. The walls are thick, far thicker than the walls of any previous Egyptian temple, The towers are tall, commanding views of the surrounding landscape and providing elevated and protected positions from which archers could fire down on attackers approaching from any direction. The entrance is designed to be easily defended against any attempted assault. A narrow, easily blocked passageway that could be sealed with heavy doors and defended by a small number of guards against a much larger attacking force. The entire complex has the feel not of a religious monument, but of a military installation. A fortress disguised as a temple, a citadel wrapped in the language of worship and commemoration. The architectural message is unmistakable. The pharaoh who commissioned, designed, financed, and personally supervised the construction of this massive and heavily fortified temple did not merely want to be remembered. He wanted to be safe. And the fact that a pharaoh of Egypt felt the need to fortify his mortuary temple tells us something profoundly disturbing about the state of Egyptian society in the late 20th dynasty, something that the victory inscriptions on the temple's walls do not acknowledge and that the official rhetoric of pharaonic power does not address. The fortifications tell a story that the inscriptions on the temple walls do not. They tell the story of a pharaoh who no longer felt safe in the heart of his own kingdom, a pharaoh who needed to fortify his temple against threats that might come not merely from foreign invaders, but from his own people. From the internal unrest, the social instability, and the growing institutional disorder that the deepening economic crisis and spreading social instability of the late 20th dynasty were generating. The reliefs on the temple walls are among the most detailed and most historically significant military scenes in all of Egyptian art. The artistic quality of the Medinet Habu reliefs deserves particular emphasis. They represent some of the finest and most detailed military art produced in the entire history of the Egyptian state, surpassing in their specificity and their dramatic intensity the battle scenes at Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, and the Ramesseum. The reliefs are not merely decorative. They are documentary, providing information about the weapons, the tactics, the formations, the equipment, and the appearance of both the Egyptian forces and their Sea People's adversaries that is available from no other source. The feathered headdresses of the Peliset and the Jekka warriors, the horned helmets of the Shurden, the distinctive ship designs of the Sea People's fleet, the ox-drawn carts carrying the migrating families. All of these details, preserved in the carved and painted stone of the temple walls, have provided modern scholars with an invaluable and otherwise irreplaceable visual record of the late Bronze Age military world that would otherwise have been entirely lost. The battle scenes depict the victories over the Sea Peoples and the Libyans with a vividness and a specificity that have made Medinet Habu one of the most important, most detailed, and most visually informative sources for the study of late Bronze Age warfare, for the reconstruction of the military events of the 12th century BC, and for the understanding of the Sea Peoples phenomenon that transformed the political geography of the ancient Near East. The land battle at Jahi is shown in a series of dramatic scenes: Egyptian chariots charging into the enemy ranks, Peliset and Jekka warriors in their distinctive feathered headdresses fighting with swords and spears, ox-drawn carts carrying the Sea People's families, women and children visible in the carts, a poignant reminder that this was a migration of entire peoples, not merely a military campaign. The naval battle is depicted with equal vividness. Egyptian warships ramming and grappling the Sea People's vessels, archers on the shore and on the ships pouring arrows into the enemy fleet, Egyptian marines boarding enemy ships and engaging in hand-to-hand combat, the bodies of dead and drowning Sea People's warriors filling the water beneath the tangled and burning ships, the Nile channels running red with the blood of the invaders, the defeated and the drowned who had thought to conquer the last great power of the ancient world, and who had instead sailed into a trap from which there was no escape. The captured Sea Peoples, those who survived the land battle and the naval engagement, were not all killed or enslaved. In a decision that demonstrated both Ramesses' pragmatism and his strategic vision, many of the captured warriors were settled on Egyptian land, given territories to farm, and incorporated into the Egyptian military establishment as auxiliary troops. The Peliset, The group most commonly identified with the biblical Philistines were settled along the southern coast of the Levant, where they established the cities that the Hebrew Bible would later describe as the Philistine Pentapolis: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. The settlement of the Sea Peoples on the Levantine coast transformed the political geography of the region and created the conditions from which the Iron Age civilizations of the Levant, including the Israelites and the Philistines, would eventually emerge. The temple also contains one of the most extensive and most historically significant texts to survive from the ancient world, the Great Harris Papyrus, which was found in a tomb near Medinet Habu, and which provides a comprehensive account of Ramesses III's reign, including his building projects, his religious donations, his military campaigns, and his administrative achievements. The Great Harris Papyrus, also known as Papyrus Harris I, is one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world. The papyrus, which measures approximately 41 meters in length and is the longest known papyrus from ancient Egypt, presents a detailed inventory of the resources that Ramesses devoted to the temples, the gods, and the people of Egypt. Resources that included vast quantities of gold, silver, copper, linen, grain, cattle, and other commodities. The papyrus is, in effect, the financial statement of Ramesses III's reign, a truly remarkable document that has absolutely no parallel in the ancient world for its comprehensiveness and its detail. The papyrus provides a comprehensive accounting of the income and the expenditure of the Egyptian state during one of the most tumultuous periods in its history. The loss of Egypt's Levantine territories was one of the most significant and most consequential developments of Ramesses's reign, a loss that was not the result of military defeat, but of the broader collapse of the political and economic structures that had sustained Egyptian influence in the region. The vassal states that had acknowledged Egyptian sovereignty for centuries, the cities of the Levantine coast, the kingdoms of the inland corridor, the trading posts and garrison towns that had connected the Nile Valley to the markets of Mesopotamia and Anatolia, had been disrupted, destroyed, or detached from Egyptian control by the Sea People's migration and by the general breakdown of the international order. The trade routes that had carried goods between Egypt and the Near East, the routes that had been a major source of wealth for the Egyptian state, providing the kingdom with essential copper, tin, timber, olive oil, wine, and luxury goods that the domestic Egyptian economy could not produce, were no longer functioning, and the loss of these critically important trade revenues further strained the already depleted Egyptian treasury at a moment when the costs of the military campaigns were rising dramatically. The Great Harris Papyrus, one of the most important documents from the reign, provides further evidence of the economic pressures that the Egyptian state was facing. The economic picture that emerges from the Great Harris Papyrus and from other sources is deeply troubling. Despite the military victories, despite the temple construction, despite the confident rhetoric of the inscriptions, the Egyptian economy was in serious and deepening trouble during Ramesses's reign. The economic crisis of Ramesses III's reign was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, grinding deterioration that worsened progressively over the course of the pharaoh's 3-decade on the throne. The costs of the military campaigns, the mobilization of the army, the construction, the equipping, and the ongoing maintenance of the navy, the provision of supplies, the payment, the feeding, and the equipping of the soldiers had placed enormous and unsustainable strain on the royal treasury. The loss of Egypt's Levantine territories, the vassal states and the trade routes that had long been a major, reliable, and strategically important source of wealth for the Egyptian state had reduced the flow of tribute and trade goods that the economy depended upon. The temples, which were the largest landowners and the largest employers in the Egyptian economy, were consuming an ever larger share of the kingdom's agricultural surplus, leaving less and less for the workers, the soldiers, the officials, the administrators, and the military who kept the state functioning. The crisis came to a head in the 29th year of Ramesses's reign, when the skilled artisans and specialized workers of the village of Deir el-Medina, the ancient, venerable, prestigious, and closely supervised community of highly skilled and professionally organized craftsmen, who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, staged what is recognized as the first recorded labor strike in human history, an event that has been celebrated by labor historians, studied by economists, and analyzed by political scientists as one of the earliest and most clearly documented examples of organized worker resistance in the archaeological record. The strike is documented in a series of papyri from Deir el-Medina, administrative records, complaint letters, and official reports that provide an extraordinarily detailed account of the workers' specific and detailed grievances, the authorities' initial confused response, and their eventual concessions, and the negotiations that eventually resolved the immediate crisis. The workers had not received their grain rations. The regular monthly payments of grain, dried fish, oil, beer, and other essential provisions that the state was contractually, institutionally, and morally obligated to provide in exchange for their labor, and they marched from their village to the vicinity of the mortuary temples on the West Bank, sat down, and refused to work. The workers' protest was organized, disciplined, and remarkably effective. They did not riot. They did not destroy property. They did not attack officials or guards. They simply and deliberately sat down and refused to work, demonstrating both their sophistication and their desperation. The workers chanted, "We are hungry," a cry that echoed across the Theban hillside, and that signaled, with devastating and unmistakable clarity, that the Egyptian state was no longer capable of fulfilling its most basic obligation to its own workers. The strike was eventually resolved. The overdue rations were delivered. The strike at Deir el-Medina was not merely a labor dispute. It was a political event of the very first magnitude, a public demonstration that the pharaonic state had failed in one of its most basic responsibilities, a crack in the facade of divine order and institutional competence that the pharaoh's inscriptions and monuments were designed to project. The workers of Deir el-Medina were not ordinary laborers. They were skilled artisans, specialists in the sacred and highly specialized arts of royal tomb construction and decoration, men whose expertise was essential for the continuation of the royal funerary tradition, and whose community was one of the most privileged and most closely supervised in the entire Egyptian state. If the state could not feed these workers, the most important and the most carefully tended of all the kingdom's labor force, then the crisis was far deeper and far more serious than any official acknowledgement suggested. Eventually, the overdue rations were finally delivered. The workers grudgingly, resentfully, and reluctantly returned to their duties, and the immediate crisis was resolved. But the resolution was temporary. The underlying problems that had caused the strike, the depletion of the treasury, the breakdown of the supply chains, the corruption of the officials, and the structural inability of the Egyptian economy to sustain the level of institutional expenditure that the pharaonic system required, remained unresolved and would continue to worsen throughout the remainder of Ramesses' reign and throughout the reigns of his successors. The episode was a symptom of a much deeper, much more systemic, and much more intractable problem, a problem that went beyond the specific failure to deliver grain rations to a specific group of workers, and that pointed to a fundamental breakdown in the administrative, economic, and institutional structures that had sustained the Egyptian state, its economy, and its social order for many centuries. The strike was not merely a labor dispute, it was a signal, a warning, a deeply alarming canary in the coal mine of a civilization that was slowly but inexorably running out of the resources it needed to function. The pharaoh who had defeated the Sea Peoples and the Libyans on the battlefield could not defeat the invisible enemy of economic decline, and the workers' cry of, "We are hungry," was the sound of a civilization confronting the limits of its own capacity to sustain itself. The economic crisis of the late 20th dynasty was not merely a fiscal problem. It was a systemic failure, a breakdown of the entire economic and administrative infrastructure that the Egyptian state depended upon for its functioning. The roots of the economic crisis lay deep in the structural realities of the Egyptian economy, realities that the military victories of Ramesses' reign had obscured, but that the passage of time would make increasingly impossible to ignore. The temple estates, which were, By the late 20th dynasty, the largest landowners, the largest employers, the largest consumers of resources, and the largest and most powerful economic institutions in the kingdom were consuming an ever larger share of the national wealth, leaving less and less for the crown, the army, the bureaucracy, and the working population. The pharaoh's ability to control the collection, the management, and the distribution of the kingdom's agricultural and mineral resources, the fundamental and absolutely essential power on which the entire pharaonic system of governance depended, was being eroded by the growing independence, the growing wealth, and the growing political influence of the temple establishments, which were becoming, in effect, states within the state, economic entities that answered to their own priesthoods rather than to the central government. The corruption of the bureaucratic apparatus was also a significant factor. The officials who were responsible for the collection and the distribution of taxes, the management of the granaries, and the payment of the workers' wages were increasingly diverting resources for their own benefit, skimming from the grain supplies, taking bribes, falsifying records, and enriching themselves at the expense of the state and the population. The corruption was deeply corrosive to the institutional fabric of the Egyptian state. It undermined the trust between the government and the population. It diverted resources from their intended purposes. It enriched a small class of officials at the expense of the workers and the farmers who produced the wealth, and it created a pervasive culture of cynicism and self-interest that eroded the sense of communal obligation and shared purpose on which the pharaonic system depended. The corruption was not new. It had existed in Egyptian society for centuries, as the surviving legal records, judicial proceedings, and administrative complaint papyri make abundantly clear. But the scale of the corruption was increasing, and the state's capacity to detect and to punish it was diminishing. The Egyptian state was running out of money. The treasury was depleted. The supply chains were breaking down. The bureaucratic apparatus that was supposed to manage the distribution of resources was becoming corrupt, inefficient, and increasingly incapable of performing its essential functions. The pharaoh who had saved Egypt from foreign invasion could not save it from economic collapse. And the economic collapse was, in many ways, a more dangerous threat than the Sea Peoples had ever been, because it attacked the foundation of the state from within, undermining the institutions, the loyalties, the reciprocal obligations, and the social contracts that held the civilization together. The economic crisis of Ramesses' later reign was not merely a fiscal problem, it was a crisis of legitimacy, a crisis that threatened the fundamental social contract between the pharaoh and his people. The pharaonic system was based on the principle of Mat, the cosmic order of justice, balance, and reciprocity that the pharaoh was responsible for maintaining. The pharaoh's obligations included not merely the defense of the kingdom and the performance of the religious rituals, but also the provision of material sustenance for the population, the reliable distribution of grain, the punctual payment of wages, the maintenance, the repair, and the continued functioning of the economic infrastructure that sustained the daily lives of ordinary Egyptians across the length and breadth of the Nile Valley. When the state could no longer fulfill these obligations, when the workers went unpaid, when the royal granaries stood empty, when the supply chains broke down, the legitimacy of the pharaonic order was called into question, and the loyalty of the population could no longer be taken for granted. The harem conspiracy must be understood in this context, not merely as the personal ambition of one woman and her son, but as a symptom of the broader institutional crisis that was undermining the authority of the pharaoh and the stability of the state. The harem conspiracy, the plot to assassinate Ramesses III and to place the son of a secondary wife on the throne, is one of the most extensively documented, most thoroughly investigated, and most dramatically consequential criminal cases from the ancient world, and one of the most dramatic episodes in the entire history of the pharaonic state. The conspiracy is known primarily from the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, a series of court documents that record the trial of the conspirators, the charges against them, the evidence presented, and the sentences imposed. The papyrus provides an extraordinarily detailed account of a palace coup that involved at least 40 named conspirators, including members of the royal family, officials of the harem, military officers, and servants of the court. The conspiracy was organized and directed by Queen Tai, one of Ramesses's secondary wives, a woman of considerable intelligence, political ambition, organizational skill, and ruthless determination, a woman whose son, Pentawere, was not the designated heir to the throne. The legitimate and designated heir was the future Ramesses IV, the eldest surviving son of a more senior wife named Titi, a man who had been carefully groomed, educated, and prepared for the succession, who had been given the titles and the responsibilities that the crown prince traditionally held, and who represented the continuation of the established order that Ti and her conspirators sought to overthrow. The stakes of the conspiracy were enormous. Not merely the life of the pharaoh, but the future political direction and the governing philosophy of the Egyptian state, the composition and the character of the ruling elite, and the distribution of the power and the wealth that the pharaonic office controlled. The conspiracy was, in this sense, not merely a murder plot, but a full-scale political revolution, a deliberate and calculated attempt to redirect the trajectory of the Egyptian state by replacing the designated heir with an alternative candidate who would serve the interests of a different faction of the royal family. Tyre's motive was straightforward. She wanted her son to inherit the kingdom instead of his half-brother, and she was willing to kill the pharaoh to achieve this goal. The scale and the sophistication of the conspiracy suggest a level of planning and coordination that went far beyond a simple assassination plot. It was, in effect, an attempted coup d'etat, a comprehensive, coordinated, and strategically calculated effort to overthrow the existing political order and to replace it entirely with a new power structure centered on Tai and her son. The conspirators included not merely palace servants and minor officials, but also military officers, administrators, and other individuals with the institutional authority, the personal connections, the political influence, the bureaucratic access, and the considerable material resources to carry out a complex, multifaceted, and highly coordinated covert operation. The use of magic, the wax figures, and the spells that the ancient texts describe was not a sign of primitive superstition, but a recognized and feared weapon in the ancient Egyptian context, where the boundary between the physical world and the supernatural world was far more permeable, far more porous, and far more easily crossed than modern sensibilities might suggest. The conspiracy was elaborate and ambitious. It involved not merely the assassination of the pharaoh, but also an attempted military mutiny and a plan to incite a revolution in the countryside. The scope of the conspiracy, involving at least 40 named individuals according to the judicial papyrus, represented a genuine and comprehensive threat to the stability of the Egyptian state, a threat that extended from the innermost chambers of the royal palace to the military garrisons, the administrative offices, and the provincial authorities of the Theban region. The plotters had recruited supporters within the army, within the bureaucracy, and within the harem itself, creating a network of co-conspirators that spanned the full range of Egyptian institutional life, and that demonstrated the depth of the factionalism and the intensity of the political rivalries that the economic crisis had generated within the ruling elite. The conspirators used what the ancient texts describe as wax figures and magical spells, rituals of sympathetic magic that were intended to weaken the pharaoh and to create confusion among the guards, making the assassination possible. The timing of the assassination was itself significant. The conspirators had chosen to strike during a moment when the pharaoh would be most vulnerable, when the crowds and the festivities would provide cover for the assassins, when the normal security arrangements and protocols would be disrupted and weakened by the presence of large numbers of visitors, pilgrims, and celebrants, and when the chaos of the occasion would make it possible for the conspirators to escape or to establish their alternative power structure before the loyalists could respond. The choice of a religious festival as the setting for the assassination was also symbolically charged. It transformed a sacred moment of celebration, thanksgiving, and divine worship into a moment of shocking blasphemous violence and intimate betrayal, desecrating the sacred occasion, violating the sanctity of the temple precinct, and demonstrating the conspirators' willingness to violate the most fundamental norms of Egyptian religious and political life in pursuit of their objectives. The plot was carried out during a religious festival at Medinet Habu, a celebration that would have brought together large numbers of people, created distractions, and provide cover for the assassins. The forensic evidence recovered from the CT scans conducted in 2012 by a team led by the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass and the radiologist Sahar Salim, and from subsequent studies published in the years following, is extraordinarily detailed and provides a vivid, almost cinematic reconstruction of the pharaoh's final moments. The CT scans of Ramesses' mummy tell the story of what happened. At least 2 assailants attacked the pharaoh simultaneously, one from behind, cutting his throat with a sharp knife or dagger, severing the trachea, the esophagus, and the major blood vessels. One from the front hacking off his left big toe with an axe or a sword. The wounds were immediately fatal. The severing of the trachea and the major blood vessels of the neck would have caused death within seconds, and the loss of the big toe, though not in itself a mortal wound, would have prevented the pharaoh from fleeing or resisting the attack. The coordination of the assault. 2 weapons, 2 attackers, 2 simultaneous wounds inflicted from 2 different directions suggests that the assassination had been meticulously planned, carefully coordinated, and precisely rehearsed, that the assassins knew exactly what they intended to do and how they intended to do it, and that they had practiced the choreography of the killing to ensure that the pharaoh would be given no opportunity to defend himself, to call for help, or to escape. The king died where he fell, murdered in his own palace, at his own festival, by members of his own household. This is not science fiction. This is what the evidence, the ancient court documents, and the modern forensic analysis tells us about the death of the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom. The conspiracy failed in its ultimate objective. The assassination of Ramesses III was a watershed moment in the history of the Egyptian state, a moment that demonstrated, with brutal and undeniable clarity, that the pharaonic system was no longer capable of protecting even the person of the pharaoh, the most sacred and the most carefully guarded individual in the entire kingdom. The fact that a conspiracy involving at least 40 people could be organized, planned, and executed within the pharaoh's own household, without being detected by the pharaoh's extensive, well-organized, well-funded, and supposedly vigilant security apparatus, without being betrayed by any of the dozens of individuals who knew about the plot, without being prevented by the guards and the officials whose primary responsibility was the protection of the pharaoh's person, speaks to a level of institutional failure that is deeply alarming, and that foreshadows the much more comprehensive institutional collapse that would consume the Egyptian state in the decades following Ramesses' death. Despite the successful assassination of Ramesses, Tia's son and Pentuer did not inherit the throne. The designated heir, Ramesses IV, took power and organized the trial of the conspirators. The judicial papyrus of Turin, the court document that records the trial proceedings, is one of the most extraordinary legal documents to survive from the ancient world. The papyrus lists the names of the conspirators, describes their roles in the plot, presents the evidence against them, and records the sentences that were imposed. The document is remarkable for its detail, its precision, and its demonstration of the sophisticated, long-established, and remarkably modern legal procedures that the Egyptian state maintained even in the aftermath of the most traumatic political crisis it had ever experienced. The fact that the conspirators were tried in a formal judicial proceeding rather than simply executed suggests that the new pharaoh, Ramesses IV, was determined to demonstrate that the rule of law would prevail even in the face of the most extreme provocation, that the Egyptian state would respond to the shocking assassination of the pharaoh not with arbitrary vengeance or indiscriminate retribution, but with the measured and documented application of justice. The trial was comprehensive and merciless. The conspirators were divided into groups based on their degree of involvement. The principal conspirators, Those who had planned and executed the assassination were sentenced to death, either by execution or by forced suicide. The papyrus divides the conspirators into several groups, each tried separately, each receiving sentences proportional to their degree of involvement. The principal conspirators, those who had planned the assassination, who had recruited the co-conspirators, and who had actually carried out the attack on the pharaoh's person, received the most severe punishment, death, either by execution or by the forced suicide that was considered a more dignified end for individuals of high rank. Those who had been involved to a lesser degree, those who had known about the conspiracy but had not actively participated, those who had provided logistical support or information, received lesser punishments, including the mutilation of their noses and ears, a punishment that permanently marked them as criminals, that denied them the physical integrity that the Egyptian afterlife required, and that ensured they would carry the visible, unmistakable, and socially devastating evidence of their treason on their bodies for the rest of their natural lives. Visible, unmistakable, and profoundly socially devastating in a culture that placed enormous importance on physical wholeness and bodily perfection. Some of the judges who conducted the trial were themselves found to have been compromised, to have engaged in inappropriate behavior with the female conspirators during the judicial proceedings. These judges were punished as well, their noses and ears removed as a mark of their dereliction of duty. The fact that even the judicial process itself was compromised by the corruption and the moral failure of the officials involved speaks to the depth of the institutional crisis that the Egyptian state was experiencing, a crisis in which the very structures and the very officials who were supposed to enforce the law and to protect the integrity of the state were themselves infected and compromised by the same failures and the same fundamental failures, the same moral compromises, and the same structural institutional weaknesses that had made the conspiracy possible in the first place. Queen Ti herself disappears from the historical record after the conspiracy. Her fate is unknown, though some scholars have speculated that she was executed by burning, a punishment that would have destroyed her body and denied her any possibility of an afterlife. The story of Pentawere, if the identification is correct, is one of the most haunting episodes in the entire history of Egyptian mortuary practice. The mummy known as Unknown Man-E, a body that was found alongside the royal mummies in the cache at Deir el-Bahari, wrapped in goat skin rather than linen, with no organs removed, and with an expression of apparent agony frozen permanently on its distorted face, has been identified, through DNA analysis conducted as part of the 2012 study, as a probable son of Ramesses III. Many scholars believe that Unknown Man-E is Pentawere himself, the prince whose mother's ambition had set in motion the chain of events that led to the assassination of the pharaoh and to the trial and punishment of the conspirators. If the identification is correct, the burial of Unknown Man-E represents the most deliberately degrading and most ritually punitive burial in the entire archaeological record of ancient Egypt. A burial designed not merely to punish the dead but to deny them the afterlife, to condemn them to an eternity of shame and suffering, to ensure that the prince who had sought the throne through patricide would spend eternity wrapped in the skin of an unclean animal, denied the sacred and essential rituals of preservation and protection that every Egyptian believed were absolutely necessary for survival in the next world. The prince whose ambitious and ruthless mother had organized the conspiracy and who had been punished with a deliberately degraded burial, wrapped in ritually impure and religiously degrading goatskin, denied the proper mummification procedures, and condemned to an afterlife of shame and suffering. The identification is not certain, but if it is correct, it means that the mother's ambition for her son resulted not in a throne, but in the most deliberately and vindictively degraded, the most ritually polluted, and the most humiliating burial in the entire corpus of Egyptian mortuary practice. A burial designed to ensure that the prince who had sought the throne through the murder of his father would spend eternity in darkness, in shame, and in the knowledge that the afterlife he had been denied was the price of the ambition that had destroyed him. Let that sink in. Consider the irony. Consider the painful, tragic, and historically instructive irony of a pharaoh who defeated the most dangerous military threat in Egyptian history, but who could not protect himself from the people who shared his bed and ate at his table. Consider what the assassination tells us about the state of the Egyptian court in the final years of Ramesses's reign. The factionalism, the desperation, the erosion of the norms and the loyalties that had traditionally protected the pharaoh's person, the willingness of members of the royal household to commit the most extreme act of political violence in pursuit of their ambitions. Consider what the assassination tells us about the fragility of power, about the deep, fundamental, and inescapable vulnerability of even the mightiest ruler to the treachery and the ambition of those who are closest to him, about the impossibility of building walls that can protect against the enemy within. The last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, the man who defeated the Sea Peoples, who saved Egypt from civilizational collapse, who held the kingdom together through decades of crisis and decline, was murdered by his own wife. The man who had faced down the most dangerous military threat in Egyptian history could not protect himself from the people who slept in his own palace. The defender of the civilization was destroyed by the civilization's own internal contradictions, by the factional rivalries that the pharaonic succession system had always contained, but that the economic and institutional crisis of the late 20th dynasty had intensified to the point of murder by the personal ambitions that had always existed within the Egyptian court, but that had been held in check by the norms, the taboos, and the institutional safeguards that were now eroding under the relentless pressure of the declining economic, political, and institutional situation. The assassination of Ramesses III was not an isolated act of political violence. It was a symptom of a much deeper and much more comprehensive institutional failure, a failure that went beyond the specific individuals who planned and executed the conspiracy, and that pointed to the fundamental weakening of the structures and the values that had sustained the pharaonic order for centuries, by the factional rivalries, the succession disputes, and the personal ambitions that had festered beneath the surface of the pharaonic order for centuries, and that had finally, in the person of Queen Tai and her co-conspirators, erupted into violence. The comparison between Ramesses III and his great namesake, Ramesses II, is instructive and deeply revealing. Ramesses II had reigned for 66 years during a period of relative stability, and had devoted his enormous energy and his vast resources to the construction of monuments, the prosecution of military campaigns, and the promotion of his own image as the greatest of the pharaohs. Ramesses III reigned for 31 years during a period of existential crisis, and had devoted his energy and his far more limited resources to the defense of the kingdom, the maintenance of the institutions, and the management of an economy that was in an advanced state of deterioration. Ramesses II built Abu Simbel, an open, celebratory, architecturally magnificent monument that proclaimed the pharaoh's power and his divinity to the world with supreme confidence and without any apparent concern for security or defense. Ramesses III built Medinet Habu, a monument that was no less architecturally ambitious, no less richly decorated, and no less theologically sophisticated, but that was enclosed within massive fortified walls and entered through a militarized gateway that would have been more appropriate for a frontier fortress than for a religious monument. Ramesses II built for glory. Ramesses III built for survival. And the difference between glory and survival, between a civilization that builds to celebrate and a civilization that builds to defend, is the difference between an empire at its peak and an empire in decline, between a world that assumes its own permanence and a world that has begun to fear its own dissolution. The difference between the two monuments, the one open and celebratory, the other defensive and fortress-like, captures, in architectural form, the difference between a civilization confidently at its peak and a civilization anxiously in decline, between a pharaoh who could afford to build for glory and a pharaoh who had to build for survival. The story of Ramesses III is, at its deepest level, a story about the limits of heroism, about what happens when a single human being, however brave, however competent, however strategically gifted, tries to hold back the tide of historical forces that are larger and more powerful than any individual. Ramesses fought the Sea Peoples, the most dangerous military threat that Egypt had faced in its entire history, a migrating nation under arms that had destroyed every other great power in the eastern Mediterranean. And he won. He fought the Libyans, the tribal confederations that had been pressing on Egypt's western frontier for decades, seeking to settle on the fertile lands of the Nile Delta. And he won, not once but 3 times, in campaigns that secured the western border and that demonstrated the continuing capability and the enduring professionalism, the organizational resilience, and the tactical competence of the Egyptian military establishment, even in an era of deepening institutional decline. He fought the political chaos that he had inherited from the collapsing 19th dynasty, and he won, restoring order, establishing the 20th dynasty, and creating an institutional framework that would sustain the Egyptian state for the remaining decades of the new kingdom. He built temples and maintained the institutions and performed the rituals and projected the image of a pharaoh in full command of a kingdom at the height of its power. But behind the victories and the monuments, the kingdom was declining, the economy was contracting, the bureaucracy was failing, the workers were striking, the treasury was empty, and the internal tensions that would eventually destroy the dynasty were building, year by year, beneath the surface of the official narrative of triumph and stability. The story of Ramesses III also raises questions about what we mean when we call a ruler great. Questions about the criteria by which we judge the achievements of historical figures and the civilizations they led. Ramesses was called the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom, a title that acknowledges his military achievements while simultaneously acknowledging that those achievements were not sufficient to prevent the decline that followed. The title contains within it a paradox. Ramesses was great precisely because the circumstances he faced were so dire, and yet his greatness could not prevent the ultimate failure of the civilization he defended. The victories over the Sea Peoples were genuine triumphs. But they were triumphs that exhausted the state, that drained the treasury, that consumed the resources that were needed for the maintenance of the institutions that held the civilization together. The pharaoh who saved Egypt from foreign conquest could not save it from its own internal contradictions. The paradox of Ramesses' reign is the paradox of every civilization in decline. The monuments continue to rise even as the foundations crumble. The temples grow larger even as the treasury grows smaller. The inscriptions proclaim victory even as the economy fails. The pharaoh presents an image of power and permanence, even as the reality of weakness and impermanence becomes increasingly impossible to deny. The gap between the official narrative and the lived reality, between what the inscriptions say and what the workers of Deir el-Medina experienced, is one of the most revealing, most eloquent, and most historically instructive gaps in the entire archaeological record of ancient Egypt. The story of Ramesses III also raises a question that is deeply relevant to the modern world. Can a civilization be saved by military force alone? Ramesses proved that it could be defended, that a skilled commander with a competent army could defeat even the most formidable external threat. But he also proved that military victory, however decisive, is not sufficient to prevent civilizational decline, that the forces of economic contraction, institutional decay, social unrest, and internal betrayal can destroy a civilization as effectively as any foreign invasion, and that the sword that defends the borders cannot repair the cracks in the foundations, and the pharaoh who defeats the foreign invader cannot, by the same act of military prowess, solve the economic crisis, reform the corrupt bureaucracy, pacify the restless workers, or prevent the ambitious from conspiring against the throne. The lesson is painful, and it is a lesson that history teaches again and again to civilizations that repeatedly fail to learn it. The military victory is celebrated, the parade is held, the inscriptions are carved, the enemy is defeated, and then the slow, invisible, undramatic work of maintaining the civilization, the work of paying the workers, managing the economy, reforming the institutions, addressing the grievances, and holding together the complex, delicate, multi-layered, and extraordinarily fragile web of relationships, obligations, and reciprocal expectations that sustain organized human society is neglected, underfunded, or simply ignored because it lacks the dramatic appeal and the political visibility of the military campaign. The workers of Deir el-Medina did not need a pharaoh who could defeat the sea peoples. They needed a pharaoh who could pay their grain rations on time. The two needs were not contradictory, but they required different skills, different priorities, and different allocations of resources. And the tragedy of Ramesses III's reign is that the resources devoted to the absolutely necessary military defense of the civilization left too little for its equally necessary economic and institutional maintenance. A dilemma that every state in crisis has faced, that every government fighting a war has confronted, and that no political leader in the history of human civilization has been able to resolve without painful trade-offs and agonizing choices. The workers of Deir el-Medina did not care about the sea peoples. They cared about their grain rations. They cared about feeding their families. They cared about the simple, concrete, immediate, physically painful, and irreducible reality of hunger. A reality that no victory inscription, no temple relief, no celebratory procession could address or alleviate. The gap between the pharaoh's narrative of triumph and the workers' experience of deprivation is one of the most revealing and most historically instructive gaps in the entire archaeological record, a gap that tells us more about the decline of the New Kingdom than 100 temple inscriptions could convey. The harem conspiracy itself can be understood as a symptom of the broader institutional failure that was consuming the Egyptian state from within. The conspiracy was not merely the product of one woman's ambition for her son. It was the product of a political culture and a court environment in which the central authority was weakening, in which factional rivalries were intensifying, in which the stakes of the succession were rising, and in which the ancient norms, the deeply ingrained taboos, and the sacred religious prohibitions that had traditionally prevented the most extreme forms of political violence within the royal household were eroding under the pressure of the economic and institutional crisis. Tyr's conspiracy was possible because the state was weak, because the institutions that should have detected and prevented the plot were compromised, because the loyalties that should have protected the pharaoh were divided, and because the desperation and the opportunism that the economic crisis had generated had created an environment in which even the most extreme, most dangerous, and most sacrilegious acts of political violence seemed, to those who perpetrated them, both justified and achievable. The question that Ramesses' story poses is not whether a civilization can survive external threats. History shows that it can, as Egypt's survival of the Bronze Age collapse demonstrates. The question is whether a civilization can survive its own success. Whether the very achievements that make a civilization great can also make it vulnerable. Whether the military victories that defend the borders can drain the treasury that sustains the economy. Whether the monuments that celebrate the pharaoh's power can consume the resources that the workers need to survive. The comparison between the external and the internal threats that Ramesses faced is illuminating. The contrast between Ramesses' military triumphs and his kingdom's economic failure is the central paradox of his reign, and it is a paradox that has resonated with historians, political scientists, and students of civilizational decline for more than a century. The military victories were real, they were impressive, and they were genuinely consequential. Without them, the Egyptian civilization would have been destroyed. But the economic failure was also undeniably real, also deeply consequential, and ultimately more destructive than any foreign invasion, because it attacked the foundation of the state rather than its borders, undermining the capacity of the government to function, to govern, to maintain order, and to sustain the social contract that held Egyptian society together. The Sea Peoples were a visible, identifiable, militarily confrontable enemy. They could be met on the battlefield, engaged with chariots and archers, defeated and captured and settled on Egyptian land. The economic crisis was invisible, amorphous, and impossible to confront with military force. It could not be charged with chariots, or shot with arrows, or captured and paraded before the pharaoh in a ceremony of triumph. The Sea Peoples could be defeated in a single battle, and they were, decisively and permanently, in the twin and decisive engagements at Jahi and the Delta. The Libyans could be defeated in a single campaign, and they were, repeatedly, over the course of Ramesses's 3-decade reign. But the economic crisis could not be defeated in a single battle or a single campaign. It was a slow, chronic, deeply embedded, and structurally rooted deterioration that required not military force but institutional reform, administrative competence, and the kind of sustained, unglamorous, politically difficult economic management that no inscription celebrates, no temple relief depicts, no pharaonic monument commemorates, and no scribal record acknowledges. The tragedy of Ramesses's reign is that the pharaoh who possessed the undeniable military genius, the strategic vision, the tactical brilliance, and the personal courage to defeat every external enemy that Egypt faced lacked, or was denied by the brutal fiscal, administrative, and institutional circumstances of his deeply troubled time, the economic resources and the institutional capacity to defeat the internal ones. The economic crisis was a slow, grinding, and ultimately irresistible force that no single battle could reverse, no military campaign could halt, and no pharaoh, however skilled or however determined, could ultimately defeat. This is the tragedy of Ramesses III, and it is a tragedy that resonates across the millennia, because the pattern it describes is not unique to ancient Egypt but is repeated, in different forms and in different circumstances, throughout the history of human civilization. The pattern that Ramesses's reign illustrates, the pattern of a civilization that defeats its external enemies but is destroyed by its internal failures, is one of the most common and one of the most instructive patterns in the entire history of human civilization. The Roman Empire faced the same pattern. It defeated or absorbed its external enemies for centuries, but it was ultimately destroyed by the combination of economic decline, political fragmentation, and institutional decay that weakened the state from within. The Han dynasty of China, the Mughal Empire of India, the Ottoman Empire, all followed the same trajectory, the same combination of external resilience and internal deterioration, the same slow grinding decline that no military victory could reverse and no institutional reform could prevent. The great empires do not fall to foreign invasion alone. They fall to the combination of external pressure and internal decay, to the simultaneous assault of enemies at the gates and rot at the core, to the fatal moment when the cost of defending the civilization exceeds the civilization's financial and institutional capacity to pay. The moment when the sword that protects the border consumes the grain that feeds the worker, when the army that defeats the invader drains the treasury that pays the official, when the war that saves the state destroys the economy that sustains it. The workers of Deir el-Medina understood this. They understood it with the clarity of people who experience economic reality, not as an abstraction, but as a daily, physical, undeniable fact. When they chanted, "We are hungry," they were not making a philosophical argument about the relationship between military expenditure and domestic welfare. They were stating a simple, concrete, and devastating truth. The state that had defeated the Sea Peoples could no longer feed its own workers. The divine authority of the pharaoh, the military prowess of the army, the theological sophistication of the priesthood, the architectural magnificence of the temples. None of these achievements meant anything to a worker whose children were hungry, whose grain rations had not arrived, and whose faith in the capacity of the state to fulfill its obligations had been shattered by the simple, brutal reality of an empty granary. It is late. Medinet Habu stands in the darkness on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, its massive sandstone walls still intact after more than 3 millennia, its relief still visible, its fortified Migdol gate still guarding an entrance that no longer needs guarding. The temple is one of the best preserved in all of Egypt, a monument that has survived more than 3,000 years of earthquakes, Nile floods, stone robbing, vandalism and neglect, its walls still bearing the scenes of the battles that saved a civilization, and the inscriptions that proclaim a triumph that was real, but that was not, in the end, sufficient. The wound on the pharaoh's throat, the 70mm gash that the CT scanner revealed beneath 3,000 years of linen wrapping, is, in many ways, the most eloquent and the most historically instructive artifact of Ramesses III's reign. more eloquent and more historically revealing than the magnificent battle reliefs at Medinet Habu, more instructive than the Great Harris Papyrus, more revealing than the inscriptions that proclaim the pharaoh's victories and the god's favour. The wound tells the truth that the monuments do not, that the pharaoh was vulnerable, that the state was failing, that the civilization was crumbling, and that the forces of decline and institutional decay could not be defeated by the sword, no matter how sharp the blade or how skilled the hand that wielded it. So here is the answer to the question we began with. Who was Ramesses III, and what does his story tell us? He was the last great pharaoh, and the word great deserves emphasis, because Ramesses III was not merely competent or merely successful, but genuinely, historically, and consequentially great. He faced challenges that would have overwhelmed a lesser ruler: the Bronze Age collapse, the Sea People's invasion, the Libyan incursions, the economic crisis, the institutional decay, and he met those challenges with a combination of military skill, strategic vision, administrative competence, and personal courage that was unmatched by any of his successors, and that was comparable to the achievements of the greatest pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties. He was the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, the last ruler of the Egyptian state who had the military capability, the strategic vision, the personal determination, and the institutional support to defend the kingdom against a major external threat and to project Egyptian power beyond the borders of the Nile Valley. He defeated the Sea Peoples, the coalition of migrating and marauding peoples who had destroyed every other great power in the eastern Mediterranean, in two of the most important battles in the history of the ancient world. He defeated the Libyans in 3 separate campaigns. He built Medinet Habu, one of the largest, most detailed, and best preserved temples in all of Egypt. He maintained the diplomatic structures, the religious institutions, the economic systems, and the complex administrative apparatus of the Egyptian state during a period of unprecedented crisis and decline. And he was murdered, killed not on the battlefield, not by a foreign enemy, not by the Sea Peoples whose invasion he had defeated, but in his own palace, at his own festival, by his own wife's conspiracy. Killed by the conspiracy of his own secondary wife, by an assassin's blade across his throat and an axe through his toe, by the very forces of internal ambition and factional rivalry that no amount of military victory could suppress. The man who saved Egypt from the Sea Peoples could not save himself from the people in his own palace. The irony is painful, and it is the irony that defines Ramesses III's place in history, the irony that makes his story not merely a chapter in the history of ancient Egypt, but a meditation on the limits of power, the fragility of civilization, and the terrible and inescapable vulnerability of even the mightiest ruler to the treachery of those he trusts. The question that Ramesses III's story ultimately poses. The question that his assassination, his military victories, his labor strikes, and his fortified temple all converge upon, is whether a civilization can be saved from within. Ramesses proved that it could be defended from without, that a competent military commander with a loyal army could defeat even the most formidable external enemy. But the enemy that killed Ramesses was not external. It was internal, intimate, domestic, personal. The blade that cut his throat was held by someone who knew him, who lived in his palace, who ate at his table, who slept under his roof. The conspiracy that destroyed him grew not from the enemy camps of the Sea Peoples, but from the factions and the rivalries and the frustrated ambitions of his own household. The most dangerous enemy was not the one at the gates, but the one at the dinner table. After Ramesses III, the decline was swift. His successors, the 8 increasingly obscure pharaohs who bore the once mighty name Ramesses, from the 4th through the 11th, none of whom possessed the military capability, the strategic vision, or the institutional support that Ramesses III had enjoyed, presided over a kingdom that was progressively, visibly, and irreversibly losing its territory, its wealth, its institutional capacity, its international prestige, and its internal cohesion. The Levantine territories were lost. The Nubian territories were lost. The authority of the pharaoh was increasingly challenged by the growing power of the Amun priesthood at Thebes, a priesthood that controlled vast landholdings, enormous accumulated wealth, and a network of institutional connections that made it, in effect, a rival power center to the pharaoh himself. The high priests of Amun, who administered the Temple of Karnak, the largest and wealthiest religious institution in Egypt, gradually assumed political and military authority in the Theban region, creating a de facto and increasingly formalized division of the kingdom between a pharaoh who controlled the delta and the cities of the north, and a high priest who controlled Upper Egypt, the Theban temples, and the vast economic resources, the enormous and steadily expanding agricultural landholdings, and the substantial labor forces that those temples commanded. The division was a clear and unmistakable indication that the centralized authority on which the pharaonic system had always depended was no longer functioning effectively. The economy continued to deteriorate. The decline was visible in every aspect of Egyptian life, in the shrinking of the empire, in the deterioration of the infrastructure, in the increasing frequency and the increasing boldness of the tomb robberies in the Valley of the Kings, documented in a series of judicial papyri from the late 20th dynasty, revealed a society in which the sacred institutions that had sustained the civilization for millennia were no longer respected, and in which the rule of law was breaking down. The trajectory of decline after Ramesses III's death was steep and irreversible. Ramesses IV, the pharaoh who had survived the harem conspiracy and who had organized the trial of his father's murderers, reigned for approximately 6 years and devoted much of his energy to the temples and to the continuation of his father's building projects, but he lacked his father's military capability, and he inherited an economy that was in an advanced state of deterioration. His successors, Ramesses V through Ramesses XI, were increasingly weak, increasingly overshadowed by the growing power of the Amun priesthood at Thebes, and increasingly unable to maintain the centralized authority that the pharaonic system required. The tomb robberies proliferated. The sacred burials of the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings, which had been protected for centuries by the religious taboos, the institutional structures, the administrative oversight, and the dedicated security forces of the state, were systematically and methodically plundered by organized gangs of robbers who bribed the guards, broke into the tombs with tools and torches, stripped the mummies of their gold, and sold the stolen goods on a thriving black market. The authorities conducted investigations, held trials, and punished the guilty. But the robberies continued, a visible, shocking, profoundly disturbing, and deeply and publicly humiliating demonstration that the Egyptian state could no longer effectively protect even the most sacred, the most venerable, and the most carefully guarded of its institutions. Within approximately 80 years of Ramesses III's death, the new kingdom was over. The pharaonic state fragmented into competing power centers. The pharaoh ruling in the north, the high priest of Amun ruling in the south, and Egypt entered the third intermediate period, a centuries-long era of political division, territorial fragmentation, foreign infiltration, and civilizational retrenchment, foreign domination, and civilizational decline from which the pharaonic system would never fully recover. The temple at Medinet Habu still stands. The reliefs still show the chariots charging, the archers firing, the sea peoples falling. The inscriptions still proclaim the pharaoh's victory, still describe the enemy's defeat, still declare the eternal supremacy of the Egyptian state and the divine authority of the pharaoh who defended it. The walls still stand, massive, fortified, imposing, built to withstand the threats that the pharaoh could see and could prepare for and could plan against. The walls were designed by architects who understood the military threats of their time and who created a structure that could resist siege, repel attack, and protect the pharaoh, his court, and his administration from the external enemies and the internal unrest that had devastated every other great power in the ancient world. The walls succeeded in their purpose. Medinet Habu was never taken by force, never successfully stormed or besieged, never sacked by foreign invaders, never breached by the external enemies against whom its fortifications were designed. But the threat that killed him came from inside the walls. The blade that ended his life was held by someone who could walk through the fortified gate without being challenged, someone who knew the layout of the palace, someone who had access to the pharaoh's person, someone who was trusted. The walls could not protect him. The walls have never been able to protect anyone, not from the enemy within, not from the conspiracies that grow in the corridors of power, not from the ambitions that fester in the hearts of the excluded, not from the resentments that accumulate in the households of the powerful, not from the slow, invisible, and ultimately irresistible forces of decline that undermine the foundations of every empire and every civilization that human beings have ever built. Ramesses III saved Egypt from the Sea Peoples. He could not save Egypt from itself, and perhaps that is the most honest and the most historically instructive lesson of his extraordinary, heroic, and ultimately tragic reign. That the greatest threat to any civilization is not the enemy at the gates, but the cracks in the foundations, the economic failures, the institutional decay, the social inequalities, the political betrayals, and the quiet, invisible, daily erosion of the structures and the values that hold a society together. The Sea Peoples are gone, the Libyans are gone, the Bronze Age is gone, but the pattern endures, the pattern of civilizations that win their wars and lose their peace, that defeat their enemies and destroy themselves, that build their monuments on foundations that are already crumbling. The temple at Medinet Habu still stands. 3,000 years after its construction, 3,000 years after the great battles it commemorates, 3,000 years after the pharaoh who built it was brutally murdered in its courts by members of his own household, the last great monument of the last great pharaoh of the last great age of ancient Egypt. The walls are still standing, the reliefs are still visible, the scenes of the chariot charges and the naval battles and the bound prisoners and the counting of the severed hands are still carved into the stone, still telling the story of the battles that saved the civilization, still proclaiming the victories that the pharaoh won and that the civilization, in the end, could not sustain. Its walls still bear the images of the battles that saved a civilization. Images that are, in their way, as eloquent and as historically significant as any monument in the ancient world. The land battle at Jahi, the naval battle of the Delta, the counting of the severed hands, the binding of the prisoners, the presentation of the captives to the pharaoh, the triumph of the divine king over the forces of chaos and destruction. The images tell a story of victory, and the victory was real. But the images do not tell the other story, the story of the economic decline, the labor strikes, the empty granaries, the corrupt officials, the conspiracy in the harem, and the blade across the throat of the pharaoh who won every battle, who defeated every foreign enemy, who saved the kingdom from every external threat, and who still, despite all of his victories and all of his courage and all of his strategic brilliance, could not save the civilization from the forces that were quietly, invisibly, and inexorably destroying it from within. And beneath those images, hidden for 31 centuries beneath layers of linen and resin and ritual, the wound on the pharaoh's throat tells the truth that the inscriptions do not, that the civilization was saved from the foreign enemy. Saved decisively, saved completely, saved by the military genius, the strategic vision, and the personal courage of a pharaoh who deserved, by any measure, the title great, and then the civilization was lost, slowly, progressively, and irreversibly, to the forces of internal decline that no military victory could reverse, and no fortified wall could keep out, and the blade that ended the life of the pharaoh who had saved it, the blade that cut across his throat while the festivities continued, and the guards failed and the conspirators struck with the coordinated precision of a military operation, was held not by a foreign invader, not by a Sea People's warrior, not by a Libyan chieftain, but by someone who had every right to be inside the walls, who had walked through the fortified Migdol Gate unchallenged, who had been trusted, and who had betrayed that trust with a violence that the ancient embalmers spent the next 3,100 years trying desperately and ultimately unsuccessfully to hide.